Welcome back, everyone. Tonight our fire burns a little brighter, because the story of Aeneas has reached the moment where peace trembles on the edge of war. Last time we saw a fragile calm in Latium and Aeneas welcomed, prophecies fulfilled, a wedding promised. But not everyone likes the sound of destiny knocking at their door. So if you're already comfortable, maybe the room is dim, the fire's steady, the blanket has achieved full toga mode, then settle in. We'll stay quiet while empires begin. In the hills around ancient Latium, whispers are turning into speeches, and speeches into swords. Pride, love, and a few badly timed omens will soon reshape the world. Let's begin. Episode 4. The War of Latium. The fire burns quietly tonight. Its light wavers on old stone walls, the same kind of light that once danced through the camps of the Trojans, long ago, when peace was still a fragile dream barely strong enough to survive the night. After the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia, Latium seemed to rest beneath a spell. For a handful of days, precious days that would be remembered later, with the particular ache reserved for moments of happiness too brief to trust, the air itself felt gentler. The fields stretched golden and still, heavy with grain that bent beneath its own abundance. The river Tiber wound lazily through the land as if the gods themselves had exhaled, its waters catching the sun and throwing back light like scattered coins. Soothing, farmers tilled their soil without fear of spears. Children played in the olive groves without mothers calling them nervously home. The people of Latinus smiled at the foreign guests, these quiet Trojans who built fires that smelled faintly of cedar and sang songs no one could quite understand, songs in a language that carried the weight of lost cities and long journeys. Even the birds seemed to linger in the air longer, their wings catching light like drifting embers, as though they too sensed this was a moment worth witnessing before the world remembered how to be cruel again. The markets bustled with easy commerce. Trojan bronze traded for Latin wine, stories exchanged along with goods, laughter rising from tables where men who had expected to be enemies discovered they could share bread without suspicion. But beneath the calm, like a current flowing deep beneath a placid surface, something stirred. Peace has a way of revealing what lies beneath it. Jealousies that had been buried, doubts that had been postponed, and memories that refused to sleep. The human heart has rooms that sunlight cannot reach, corners where resentment breeds in shadow. And so it was that word of Aeneas's marriage spread beyond the kingdom's borders, carried on the gossip of merchants whose roots connected cities like threads in an invisible web. The story grew as it travelled, acquiring details the original event never possessed, transformed by each telling until it became less about what had happened, and more about what it meant to those who heard it. In the city of Ardea, built on hills overlooking the sea, it reached the ears of Turnus, prince of the Rutulians, proud, fierce, and once promised to Lavinia himself. He was a man carved from volcanic stone, hard, enduring, shaped by heat into something that could not bend without breaking. Turnus stood on the steps of his palace when the news came. In that particular hour when shadows grow long and the day contemplates its ending, his armor, polished to a bronze gleam, caught the setting sun and turned his face into something half divine, half furious. A herald bowed low, his body language confessing fear before his mouth could shape words. "My lord, King Latinus has given Lavinia's hand to the foreigner, Aeneas. The marriage has been blessed by omens and the gods. They say even Venus herself smiled upon the union." For a moment that stretched beyond time, the prince said nothing. He only looked toward the horizon westward, where the Trojans had built their camp by the river. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened like iron cooling after the forge. "Blessed by the gods, is it?" he said softly, and there was more danger in that softness than any shout could carry. "Then let the gods choose their side when the fire comes. Let them decide whether they prefer prophecy or justice." He turned and walked back into the hall, his footsteps echoing like drums of war, each step a declaration that this insult would not be borne in silence. The people of Ardea still remembered the ancient ways, the hot blood of warriors, the pride of lineage stretching back to when gods walked more freely among mortals. To them, Turnus was not merely a prince, he was a symbol, a reminder of what Italy had been before foreign sails touched its shores. They remembered when the land was theirs without question, when every marriage was negotiated between families who shared ancestors and gods. This marriage to Aeneas felt like theft, not just of a bride but of their own story, their own right to determine their future. By the next morning, men whispered in taverns and along roads, "The stranger has stolen our bride," and with every retelling, the story grew sharper, like a blade being honed. Details were added, some true, some embellished, some invented from collective resentment. They forgot that Turnus's claim had never been formalized, that oracles had spoken, that Latinus himself had chosen this path. Convenience and anger make selective historians of us all. Meanwhile, in the hills above the Tiber, Queen Amata could find no rest. Sleep brought only dreams that left her gasping awake in darkness. She had watched her daughter's wedding with a smile carved from duty, not joy, a mother's performance of approval while her heart screamed protest. To her, Aeneas was no hero. She saw only a wanderer who had brought ruin to his own city, and now came seeking another. What kind of man survives when his entire city falls? What kind of man carries such a destiny and expects others to welcome it? Night after night she lit incense before the household gods, watching smoke curl upward, begging them to undo what had been done. But the gods had grown silent. Or perhaps they simply listened elsewhere, their attention drawn to larger patterns than one mother's fear. In that silence, grief turned to anger, and anger turned to prayer, not to Jupiter or the calm gods of reason, but to Juno herself, queen of the gods, still bitter from Troy's burning, still nursing old wounds that time had failed to heal. The queen's whispers reached the goddess like smoke drifting through the heavens, and Juno, magnificent in her resentment, terrible in her memory, smiled faintly. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who sees an opportunity to settle old scores. "Ah," she murmured. "So even peace can offend the gods. How delightful. Let me show them what peace costs when Juno is not consulted, when Venus's brat thinks he can simply take what he desires." From the clouds she descended, invisible but felt as a change in air pressure, as a sudden chill despite the season's warmth. Her chariot sliced through the air with the hiss of displaced wind. She walked among the hills of Latium like a storm, deciding where to break, her hands trailing sparks of divine resentment that fell to earth as seeds of discord. When she reached Turnus's camp, she leaned close to the sleeping prince, her voice wrapping around him like storm-soaked air. "Are you content, Turnus?" she breathed into his dreaming mind. "To see your promised bride stolen by a foreigner, to let the house of Troy root itself in your soil while your sword lies sleeping. What kind of prince allows such insult?" Sharp breath. He started awake, gasping, and though he could not see her, he felt her presence, heavy as thunderclouds. "I would not have peace, goddess," he said through clenched teeth. "Not while I live. If the gods want war, they shall have it." And so, with divine breath fanning mortal anger into flame, the spark was set. What had been merely possibility became inevitability. What had been one man's injured pride became a cause. The first flames of war rarely begin with trumpets. They begin in whispers, in jealousy and pride, in the murmurs of gods who never learn to forgive. They begin in the space between what is and what was promised, in the human heart's infinite capacity to feel wronged. Quiet tension. That night, the forests of Latium seemed to hold their breath. Wolves prowled restlessly, their howls carrying farther than usual. The river murmured darker songs, its voice taking on undertones that fishermen would later claim they recognized as warnings. In the Trojan camp, Aeneas dreamed of a river of blood, and awoke to the sound of hooves approaching, messengers bearing news that could not wait for morning. Scouts returned at dawn, their horses lathered despite the cool air. They spoke of Rutulian patrols crossing fields in numbers too large to be routine, of fires seen from northern ridges, of banners rising in patterns that could only mean preparation for war. Aeneas stood before them in pale morning light, his cloak wrapped loosely, his face calm but eyes heavy with weariness. He listened without interrupting. "So it begins," he said quietly. "Peace never lasts where destiny walks. We should have known." He gathered his captains, faithful Ochates, young Ascanulus, and others who had followed him through storm and sea. Around them the camp stirred as word spread. The war they'd hoped to avoid was coming. The Trojans were not strangers to battle. They had fled burning Troy, crossed hostile lands, faced tempests that split ships like toys. Yet here, in Italy, they had hoped the swords could rest, could gather dust while their owners learned gentler trades. That hope was dying as surely as if someone had put a blade through its heart. Now those same swords were being whetted once more, edges tested, straps replaced, shields reinforced. The familiar rituals of preparation began again, prayers offered to gods who seemed to favour violence over peace. King Latinus, meanwhile, felt the weight of age pressing on him like the stones of his ancestors' tombs. He had hoped the gods would be satisfied, that Aeneas's marriage would fulfill the prophecy completely, that destiny would be content and leave them all in peace. Weary, but each dawn brought darker news. Delegations arriving with demands that grew more strident, voices raised in his own halls calling for action. He was too old for another war, too tired to navigate the politics of violence. Delegations came to his court demanding justice, though their definitions varied wildly depending on which side they represented. The Rutulians thundered at his gates, their banners crimson with wrath, their voices united in anger. Latinus tried to speak reason, to summon both sides for counsel. But reason is a fragile thing when pride begins to march, when honor feels insulted, when men have already decided what they want to believe. At last, exhausted by arguments he could not win, he withdrew from his hall, refusing to call his men to war, hoping that silence would slow the tide. But silence too can be mistaken for weakness. In that vacuum, war found room to grow. In Ardea, Turnus gathered allies with practiced skill. The Volscians came, warriors from mountain strongholds. The Oroncans answered his call. The mountain tribes who had long resented Latium's growing power saw opportunity in chaos. He rode through their camps with fire in his eyes, speaking of honor defended and insults that demanded answer, of stolen brides and gods insulted by foreign hands. Rising intensity, men shouted his name, each shout building until it became a wave of sound. Spears clashed against shields in rhythm, creating thunder that rolled across the valley like a storm announcing its arrival. By dusk, his army stretched from the forests to the riverbanks, a sea of bronze and fury, of men convinced they fought for something larger than themselves. Far away, in the Trojan camp, the fires were quieter, the voices subdued. Aeneas did not shout or rage. He simply stood before the sacred altar, the same one he had carried from burning Troy. He placed his hand upon the worn stone and whispered, "If this is the path laid by fate, then let it be walked in honor. But let no blood be spilled without purpose." The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. For a moment the camp seemed still, the hush before the first drop of rain. Then came the call of a horn, distant but clear, cutting through the evening air. The war of Latium had begun. They say that before the first battle, even the gods paused to watch. Jupiter looked down and saw threads of destiny twisting together, red and gold, love and death, prophecy and pride. He said nothing. And in that divine silence, mortals moved toward their fates. Aeneas strapped on the armor forged by Vulcan armor that shone with the history of Rome yet to come. Scenes of unborn empires shimmered across the bronze, the she-wolf nursing twin infants, the triumphs of future Caesars, the eternal city rising from dust. As he lifted his shield, it caught the sunrise, and for a heartbeat he looked less like a man than a promise kept. Back in the palace, Queen Amata wept at her window. Lavinia stood beside her, silent, her golden hair catching dawn's light. Somewhere deep within her, a terrible knowing had taken root, that her love would be written in blood before peace could ever return. Outside, the drums began to sound. The first war bands moved through the valleys, their sandals beating the earth like a single heartbeat. Dust rose behind them, veiling the sky, and so ended the peace of Latium. Morning drifted across the hills of Latium, slow and golden, as though the world itself hoped that if it moved gently enough, war might forget to begin. But destiny does not oversleep. If it did, the gods would probably shake it awake. And today, that job belonged to Juno. The queen of the heavens had watched Turnus stir in fury, and Latinus sigh in despair, but the goddess wanted more than human quarrels. She wanted chaos wide enough to drown prophecy. So she summoned one of her oldest allies, a creature older than regret itself. Alecto, spirit of vengeance, sower of madness. To call her a fury is accurate, but not complete. Alecto is the whisper that turns a bruise into murder, the spark that convinces peace it is cowardice. Think of her as divine irritation with fangs. She rose from her pit beneath the earth, trailing smoke that smelled faintly of iron and nightmares. Serpents twisted through her hair, hissing like rain on bronze. When she reached Juno's side, she bowed low, eyes glowing with the pleasure of purpose. "What heart shall I break for you, great queen?" "Begin with the women," Juno said. "They are always the quickest to feel, the slowest to forget. Find Queen Amata. She already despises Aeneas. All she needs is fire." And so, Alecto slipped unseen into the palace of Latinus. The queen sat in her chamber, exhausted from prayer. The air smelled of incense and wilted laurel. Outside, distant horns murmured, "Not yet battle, merely nerves." Alecto glided behind her, invisible, and breathed a single thread of venom into her ear. It was not poison of the body but of thought. It spoke in her own voice, only crueler. "They have stolen your daughter. They have stolen your honor." The queen's hands trembled. She looked around the empty room, certain someone had spoken. "Rise, Amata. You are not helpless. Make them see." She stood and walked through the corridors barefoot, her hair unbound. Servants watched her pass, whispering that the queen looked like one touched by the divine, or perhaps by something far less holy. She found Lavinia in the courtyard, weaving a garland of flowers. "Child," she said, "we must leave this place. The gods are wrong. They cannot mean you for that foreigner. You are Latin blood, royal blood." Lavinia looked up, startled. "Mother, please. Father believes this marriage will bring peace." "Peace?" Amata laughed, a sound that made the birds in the fig trees take flight. "Peace is just a pause between betrayals." Even Alecto tilted her head, quietly impressed by the line. By the time Latinus heard the commotion, Amata had gathered a small crowd of women, mothers, widows, daughters, all shouting that they would not see their princess chained to a stranger. They filled the streets, shaking ivy and torches, singing wild hymns to Bacchus. It looked less like rebellion and more like a festival that had lost its invitation list. Gentle humour. If you've ever seen respectable matrons run through town pretending to be Maenads, you know why even the guards decided it was safer to step aside. Thus, the first cries of unrest rose not from soldiers, but from the hearts of frightened women. Alecto smiled. One spark lit, 2 to go. Her next visit was to Turnus. The prince was sharpening his spear when she came, not that she arrived in her true form. Instead, she took the shape of an aged priestess, bent and trembling, leaning on a staff of olive wood. "My son," she croaked, "I come from Juno herself. She sends warning. The foreigner prepares to make war upon you. He arms his men even now." Turnus frowned. "Strange," he said. "I thought I was the angry one." The old woman blinked, briefly confused. Gods rarely receive sarcasm gracefully, then pressed on. "Would you let him take your bride and your kingdom both? Rise, prince, strike first, and the gods will call you just." Turnus leaned on his spear and studied her. "If the gods wish me to fight, they could send a clearer sign." Alecto smiled, and her eyes burned like twin coals. The disguise melted away, her serpents writhed and hissed. The ground split beneath her feet, and the smell of brimstone filled the air. "Is this sign clear enough, mortal?" she hissed. The prince stumbled back, awe and terror fighting in his chest. Then something darker took hold, a heat behind his eyes, a sweetness in his veins, the fury of 1,000 wrongs remembered at once. Reflective, dark, he seized his spear and lifted it high. "Then let the fields of Latium bear witness," he shouted. "Turnus will not be silent." From the hills, shepherds heard the cry and thought it thunder. Alecto left him raging and turned her gaze toward the countryside. She had one final spark to set, the one that would turn whispers into war drums. Near the edge of the forest lived a young stag, tame as a pet, raised by the children of King Latinus's herdsmen. They had named him Silvius, fed him by hand, and tied small ribbons in his antlers. He was the sort of creature everyone liked. Gentle, photogenic, and terrible for political stability. Alecto watched him graze by the stream and smiled. From her pouch she drew a drop of venom and let it fall upon his flank. The stag, startled, bolted into the woods, and fate began to run with him. Not long after, a band of Trojan hunters passed through that same forest. Among them was Aeneas, eager to prove his skill. He wasn't the best shot, legends rarely mention teenage archery accuracy, but youth has enthusiasm to spare. The stag burst from the thicket, ribbons flashing. It looked wild in that moment, and Aeneas loosed an arrow. The shaft struck true. Too true. Silvius stumbled, his blood staining the reeds. A moment later, the herdsman's sons found the dying animal. They knelt beside it, grief turning quickly to rage. "The foreigners," they spat. "They bring ruin, even to the innocent." They lifted the stag's body and carried it home. Word spread faster than truth. Within an hour, men from nearby farms took up spears and clubs. At first it was shouting, Trojans defending themselves, Latins demanding justice. Then someone threw the first stone, and the argument became history's oldest story. Dust rose, arrows hissed, and the piece of Latium broke like thin glass. From the hills, Alecto watched with satisfaction. She stretched her wings and laughed, the sound echoing like a storm trapped inside a cave. Below, the skirmish grew. Men who had shared bread days before now clashed with blades. Others fled to summon reinforcements. The ground drank its first blood of the war. In the palace, Latinus heard the shouting from miles away, carried on the wind. He felt it before the messengers arrived. "So," he murmured, "it has begun without me." When the news reached Aeneas, he closed his eyes, not in shock but in recognition. Fate always finds the narrowest road to reach its end. "Gather the men," he said, "but do not strike first. Let us see if the gods will be satisfied with one life instead of 100. Aeneas nodded, already strapping his armor. "I doubt the gods have learned moderation," he said. "No," Aeneas replied, "but we may as well set a good example." They marched toward the field where the bodies lay. The stag, the herdsman, the first fallen Trojans. Smoke rose in slender columns, twisting into the sky like unanswered prayers. The two groups faced one another across the meadow, their shadows long in the late afternoon. Aeneas stepped forward, hands raised. "Brothers of Latium," he called, "we did not come to steal or to slay. The arrow was a mistake, a sorrow shared by all who live under the same sun. Lay down your arms and we can bury the dead together." For a heartbeat. No one moved. Then Turnus rode into view, his armor blazing in the light. His face set like stone. "A mistake," he roared. "Every wound from foreign hands is called a mistake. Tell me, Trojan, how many mistakes must we endure before we call it war?" The crowd stirred. Aeneas lowered his head, not in shame but in pity. "You could simply talk to me," he said quietly. "It's faster than destiny." Turnus heard but could not answer through the fury that filled him. He spurred his horse and threw his spear. It struck Aeneas's shield and glanced away, a warning from both man and fate. In the same instant, the plain erupted. Spears, arrows, shouting, chaos spreading like spilled oil. The war of Latium had found its first true roar. The sun slid behind a veil of dust. The smell of iron and sweat thickened the air. Men fell, shouting prayers they half remembered. But even amid the noise, Aeneas moved like a man in a dream, calm, deliberate, his eyes fixed not on enemies but on the horizon, as if he could already see the long road to Rome. Night fell before victory chose a side. Fires dotted the plain like scattered stars. The wounded groaned. The gods watched in silence. Alecto returned to Juno's chariot, her work complete, and bowed. "The seed is sown," she said. "Let men tend the harvest." Juno gazed down upon the smoking field and smiled thinly. "Well done. Leave them now, mortals are excellent gardeners of misery." It was the closest thing to a compliment anyone had ever received from her. In the Trojan camp, silence settled. The wounded slept under linen cloth. The unhurt stared into the fire, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. Aeneas sat apart, washing his hands in a bowl of water gone pink with blood. He watched the ripples fade and felt the weight of prophecy pressing on his shoulders. "The fates are patient," he murmured, "but never kind." Aeneas poured him wine. "Then let's drink to their patience," he said. "If they must have their story, we might as well stay hydrated." Aeneas managed a quiet laugh. Even heroes, after all, need friends who can find humor in tragedy. Around them, the fire crackled. Sparks drifted upward, brief as lives, bright as memories. The night deepened. Somewhere, an owl called, not omen, merely bird. For a little while, the world remembered how to be calm. But in the morning, messengers would ride, alliances would form, and the war of Latium would spread like dawn itself. For now, rest beside the fire. The storm has only just begun. Smoke still hung above the fields like a second sky, faint and bruised with the memory of battle. The fires of yesterday had not yet cooled, and in their pale light the world looked as if someone had tried to erase it and changed their mind halfway through. Which, to be fair, is how most wars begin, an enthusiastic sketch of destiny, badly edited by gods with shaky hands. Across the camp, Aeneas sat beside a small brazier, feeding it splinters of cedar. The scent drifted through the morning mist, sharp and comforting, like old memory. The men around him moved quietly. They mended torn leather, counted arrows, or simply stared at nothing. The kind of silence soldiers keep when there are no orders left to argue about. Even Achates, usually generous with commentary, had resorted to whistling softly through a broken reed, producing notes so uncertain they seemed afraid to be heard. Aeneas watched the smoke twist upward, and thought of what must come next. Peace was shattered. Words could no longer mend what the gods had torn, yet he would still try. If blood must flow, he murmured, let it at least be for a purpose greater than pride. He rose, fastening his cloak, and called for his captains. The meeting was simple. They would seek allies. The Latins had Turnus and the restless tribes. The Trojans had only hope, a handful of ships, and a reputation for surviving bad odds. It wasn't much, but sometimes destiny prefers small beginnings. Aeneas decided to travel north toward the Etruscans, whose lands stretched along the shining bends of the Tiber. Rumour said their king, Tarchon, waited for a sign, weary of Turnus and his allies, but cautious of foreign heroes with divine mothers. Divine parentage sounds impressive, until it starts wars in your neighbourhood. Before departing, Aeneas walked once more through the camp. He stopped beside Ascanius, who sat polishing a dented shield with the focus only teenagers and perfectionists share. Stay close to Achates, Aeneas said. Listen more than you speak, and if the gods send more prophecies, tell them to wait until I'm back. Ascanius smiled. You think the gods listen to scheduling requests? If they did, Aeneas replied, Troy would still be standing. He clasped his son's shoulder, then turned toward the river where small boats waited like obedient animals. The oars dipped, catching the light, and the vessel moved north. Behind him, the camp faded into haze. Ahead, the land opened into endless folds of green and gold. For 3 days they rowed. Villagers watched them pass in wary silence. Sometimes children waved, sometimes dogs barked, sometimes both at once, which is the natural rhythm of diplomacy. At night, they camped by the river bank. The sound of water replaced the noise of war, and for a few hours the men remembered what quiet felt like. Southing humour snored loudly, which somewhat ruined the mood, but even that was better than the silence of waiting for enemies. On the 4th morning, the hills ahead grew steeper, crowned with stone walls and towers. The banners of the Etruscans shimmered in the light, dark red with symbols older than memory. They were a proud people, masters of bronze and prophecy, and if half the rumours were true, half divine themselves. Messengers met them at the gate, and led them to King Tarchon's hall, where incense burned and bronze doors gleamed like sunlight trapped in metal. The throne was taller than necessary, which is a common royal trait, height by furniture if not by stature. Tarchon studied Aeneas for a long time before speaking. We have heard of you, Trojan. You flee one war and bring another. We flee nothing, Aeneas said. We follow what cannot be refused, a kingdom promised, not taken. But peace demands strength, and strength demands friends. The hall murmured. The Etruscans were tired of Turnus, but joining foreign causes was rarely fashionable. Tarchon raised a hand. You speak well, Aeneas, but gods whisper to every man who wants something. Why should we follow you and not Turnus? Aeneas stepped forward. He unwrapped a small golden token, a piece of armour forged by Vulcan, its surface alive with faint fire. Because the gods do not merely whisper to me, he said softly. They have already left their mark. The metal glowed in the half-light, painting faces with sunrise. For a moment even the skeptics forgot to breathe. Then an old soothsayer rose from his seat beside the throne, his eyes clouded with age, yet clear with purpose. This man carries destiny upon his shoulders, he said. The omens have spoken of him, the foreign blood that shall root itself in Italy and grow into empire. The room fell silent. Tarchon leaned back, fingers tapping the armrest. He was a cautious man, but caution bends before prophecy, the way grass bends before wind. Then we will fight beside you, Aeneas of Troy. The Etruscans stand against Turnus and his fury. Aeneas bowed deeply. You honour both men and gods. Achates whispered, and save us a great deal of dying. They sealed the alliance with wine poured into bronze cups, thick, sweet, and far stronger than politeness required. By the 3rd toast, even the sternest priest was smiling. By the 5th, Achates was attempting to summarize Trojan history through interpretive dance. Laughter filled the hall, rare, genuine, and brief. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills, as if Juno had remembered she was still angry. That night, Aeneas slept beneath the roof of his new allies. His dreams were not peaceful but steady, the kind of dreams that come when purpose replaces fear. In one, he saw a white sow by the river, surrounded by 30 piglets, the sign Venus had promised him long ago, symbol of the city that would rise from his line. When he woke, he told no one. Some visions are too fragile to speak aloud until they are safe within memory. The next day, preparations began. Blacksmiths hammered bronze, women sewed banners, priests murmured blessings in languages that had already forgotten how to doubt. The Etruscan camp swelled with life. Fires blazed at night, casting the hills in gold and shadow. Aeneas walked among them, listening, learning their ways. He saw the craftsmen etch lightning bolts onto helmets, not for beauty but belief. Each line meant protection from unseen hands. He privately hoped Vulcan wouldn't take it as plagiarism. Far away in Latium, Turnus heard of the new alliance. His anger, already volcanic, found new heat. "So the foreigner seeks more foreigners," he said. "Let him. I will show Italy what loyalty looks like when it bleeds." He called his captains, warriors of many tribes, the fierce Oroncans from the hills, the Volscians with their narrow shields, the Sabines, the Marsians who fought with serpents painted on their arms. They gathered like storm clouds, each darker than the last. Turnus addressed them from a rise overlooking the plain. "Men of Italy," he cried, "you have heard the talk of omens, of destiny favouring strangers. I tell you, destiny belongs to those who claim it. The gods reward courage, not refugees." The crowd roared. Spears struck shields. Banners snapped in the wind. Even those who doubted shouted, unwilling to sound like cowards. War has always been fluent in pride. Among the Rutulians stood Camilla, swift queen of the Volscians, daughter of the wild and the wind. She had been raised among hunters, and could ride a horse faster than most men could pray. When she heard Turnus speak, she smiled faintly, not for love of him, but for the promise of battle. "If the gods favour Aeneas," she murmured, "they will have to run to keep up with me." Turnus welcomed her gladly. With Camilla beside him, his army became legend before the first trumpet sounded. Back in the north, Aeneas gathered his allies on the banks of the river. The morning mist clung to armour and horsehair, banners dripped dew like sweat before effort. The Etruscans formed their ranks, tall, disciplined, bronze-bright, while Trojans stood beside them, their accents mingling in new camaraderie. Gentle tone, Aeneas addressed them not with thunder, but with quiet conviction. "We do not fight to conquer," he said. "We fight to endure, to build something that outlives us all." His words spread through the ranks like warmth through metal. Men straightened their backs, the sound of breathing became a single rhythm. Then the priests came forward. They slaughtered a white bull to Jupiter, letting its blood fall into the river, not for cruelty but for covenant. The water turned red, then clear again, as if the gods accepted the offering and washed their hands of guilt. Trumpets sounded. Not yet war, but readiness. The oars were dipped. The ships began their slow journey downstream toward the plains of Latium. On the decks, soldiers watched the banks drift by, olive groves, ruined farms, children waving from doorways. Each scene was both farewell and reminder of why they marched. Accompany, still half hungover from the Etruscan celebration, leaned on the railing and muttered, "If fate truly loves you, maybe she'll give us wind at our backs." Fate, Aeneas said, usually prefers a headwind. They laughed softly, brief, human, necessary, as the river carried them onward. Far behind, Venus watched from a cloud, her heart split between pride and worry. She whispered to Neptune for calm waters and to Jupiter for leniency, though she knew he would pretend not to hear. Above them all, Juno watched too, her eyes cold. She said nothing, but the air around her darkened slightly, like clouds considering mischief. When night came, the ships moored beside a grove of poplars. Fires were lit, bread was broken, and wine was passed from hand to hand. The men spoke of home, the one they'd lost, and the one they hoped to build. Each story sounded alike, as if homes are all versions of the same dream. One soldier swore that when this war ended, he'd plant vines and make a wine so good even the gods would behave politely. The others told him he'd better hurry, as divine politeness was famously short-lived. Laughter faded into song, low and steady, a tune carried from Troy itself. The notes drifted over the water, mingling with the sound of crickets and the slow pulse of the current. Aeneas listened until sleep crept close. For the first time in many nights, his dreams were kind. He saw not war, but a city rising from marsh and clay, shining domes, bridges arched like rainbows, fires burning peacefully in every home. Voices spoke Latin and Trojan as one. When he woke, the image lingered like a blessing he dared not claim yet. The following afternoon, they reached the confluence where the river widened toward Latium. Scouts rode ahead, and word spread that Turnus's army had moved closer to the shore. The final confrontation would come soon, but for now there was still the fragile pause before thunder. On a small rise above the camp, Aeneas and Tarchon stood together watching the sunset. Old tone. Unreflective to tone with trilton subrecles. Does that make the dying easier? No, Aeneas answered. It only makes the living heavier. The Etruscan king nodded, understanding more than he wished. Then we shall share the weight until one of us drops it. Then we shall share the weight until one of us drops it. A fair alliance, Aeneas said. The two men watched the last light fade. Below them, campfires bloomed like stars fallen to earth. Above, the real stars answered, patient and indifferent. The air cooled, carrying the scent of pine and river water. The murmurs of the men softened into quiet, 1,000 hearts beating under the same sky. In that stillness, the war of Latium paused to take a breath. Even the gods, perhaps, leaned closer to listen. The world was quiet in that strange way that happens before great noise, a silence so heavy it feels rehearsed. Across the plains of Latium, tents had begun to bloom like pale blossoms on scorched earth. Smoke from hundreds of fires drifted upward, painting faint grey lines against the sky. Someone once said that armies are simply cities with worse plumbing, and looking across those fields, one could almost believe it. In the south, Turnus's host sprawled beside the river Numicus. Spears glimmered like reeds in the morning light, horses stamped, impatient for purpose. The air smelled of bronze, leather, and the sort of courage that comes from pretending you're not afraid. He had gathered them from every corner of Italy, tribes who spoke in different dialects but understood perfectly the language of pride. Closest to Turnus camped the Rutulians, his own people, their shields painted deep red like sunset wine. Beside them stood the Auruncans, rough mountain men whose laughter was louder than their manners. They sang songs with too many verses and too little melody. But even the gods seemed unwilling to interrupt. Next came the Sabines, old and disciplined, their leaders grey-haired but fierce. They marched with spears carved from ash and carried small idols of their household gods tied to their belts. To them, this was not just war, it was inheritance. From the east rode the Maruvians, draped in wolfskins, eyes lined with soot. They claimed to understand the tongues of animals and the moods of rivers. When they moved, their chants rolled like distant thunder. Then came Camilla, queen of the Volscians, her company riding light as wind. Their armour gleamed with feminine precision, elegant yet deadly. Camilla herself rode at the front, her hair bound in bronze, her gaze steady as a hawk's. She carried no sword, only a spear so finely balanced it seemed an extension of her arm. She smiled at Turnus and said, "If you tire before the first clash, I'll lend you one of my horses." Turnus laughed. "If you reach the enemy first, save some for the rest of us." He admired her spirit. In truth, everyone did. Even the most battle-scarred veterans lowered their voices when she passed, uncertain whether to salute or propose marriage. Thus the southern host readied itself, men and women, nobles and shepherds, all bound by anger and the seductive rhythm of drums. North of them, along the Tiber, the Trojans and their allies prepared as well. Aeneas's camp had grown into something vast yet ordered, a living map of hope. Pathways wound between rows of tents, each marked with carved emblems, ships, stars, she-wolves, laurel leaves. The Etruscans had arrived in force, bronze-helmed soldiers moving with quiet precision. They built altars before their barracks, offering wine to Tinia, their sky-father, and to Uni, their queen of the heavens. The priests argued politely over whether Tinia or Jupiter deserved the better cut of meat. Diplomacy began, as usual, at the dinner table. Aeneas let them have their debates. Faith, after all, was another kind of armour. The Trojans trained beside them. Men hardened by seas rather than soil. Their movements were fluid, more dance than drill, their shields still bearing the scars of Troy. The Etruscans called them sea-born. half in respect, half in superstition. Each evening, the two peoples feasted together. Language barriers dissolved over roasted grain and laughter. If nothing else, war is an excellent language teacher. Aeneas walked the camp in silence, watching fires reflected in bronze helmets, listening to murmured stories of home, of gods, of small victories that made men feel immortal for a night. He carried himself not as a king, but as a shepherd of resolve. When soldiers faltered, he spoke softly, never shouting. Authority born of calm endures longer than fear. At times he paused before the shrine of Venus his mother had given him, a small marble likeness that seemed almost to breathe in the firelight. "Guide me," he whispered, "not to victory, but to meaning." Behind him, Ascanius trained with other young men, his movements still awkward but full of promise. The veterans watched fondly, betting quietly on which generation would make fewer mistakes. The consensus? None of them. At sunset, the sound of hammers filled the air. Armourers worked tirelessly, bronze ringing on bronze, sparks tracing constellations in miniature. They repaired dented shields, shaped spearheads, mended leather straps worn by travel. Women from the nearby villages came to help, bringing bread, water, and blessings. It was a strange sight. War and domesticity weaving together like threads in a single cloth. Even amid preparation for killing, people find ways to live. The central square of the camp became a theatre of devotion. Priests led rituals beneath a sky bruised purple with dusk. Fires flickered in wide circles, each flame a small echo of the sun that had set. Aeneas himself sacrificed a bull to Jupiter. The smoke rose straight upward, a sign of approval, and the men exhaled as though the god had personally guaranteed their insurance. The Shetites whispered, "Good omen. Maybe now the gods will mind their own business." A reflective sighed faintly. "They never do." The night before departure, he called a council beneath the great oak at the edge of the camp. The captains gathered, cloaks drawn, faces lit by torches. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and iron. Cicadas droned like distant drums. "Tomorrow," Aeneas said, "we march together, Trojans and Etruscans, sons of many lands. We do not fight for conquest, but for the right to stand beneath one sky without kneeling." He paused, letting silence measure the words. "And if anyone forgets which side they're on, follow the banners with fewer holes." A ripple of laughter moved through the group, easing the tension like a small wind stirring leaves. Tarchon, the Etruscan king, stepped forward. "Troy fell, yet you still build," he said. "Perhaps that is what makes your people dangerous, not anger, but endurance." Aeneas inclined his head. "Endurance is merely stubbornness made holy." Around them the fire crackled, embers rising and fading, each one a story waiting to be told by someone who survived. The next morning, the camp stirred before the sun. Horses snorted, chariots creaked, armor clicked softly like 1,000 clocks counting down the same hour. The smell of smoke and dew mixed in the air, that peculiar perfume of departure known only to soldiers and travelers. Banners were lifted, each color telling its own tale: the Trojan crimson, the Etruscan black and gold, the smaller standards of allied tribes, a tapestry of intent. Musicians played long horns carved from ivory. The sound rolled across the valley, low, resonant, almost sorrowful. Even the birds fell silent, listening. As they marched, the lines stretched for miles, glinting like a slow river of metal. From the hills, shepherds watched, shading their eyes, uncertain whether to pray or pack. The sun climbed higher, burning mist from the fields. Bees stirred among the thistles, oblivious to the history passing by their hives. It's worth noting that bees have survived every human empire, possibly because they don't hold councils. At midday they rested beside an ancient shrine, little more than 3 stones and a fig tree. The priests offered bread and wine, the men drank water from their helmets. Aeneas knelt there for a moment, touching the earth. "Each step we take is borrowed," he whispered. "Let us return it unbroken." They resumed their march, slower now, the rhythm of sandals matching the beat of drums. In the distance, faint plumes of smoke marked Turnus's camp. Between them stretched the river, broad and gleaming like a boundary drawn by the gods themselves. The Etruscans began building rafts. Trojans reinforced their shields with new bronze plates. Children from nearby villages came to watch, wide-eyed, uncertain which side to admire. One little boy asked Actes if heroes ever get time off. Actes told him yes, but usually only permanently. The boy didn't get the joke, which may have been for the best. On the opposite bank, Turnus's scouts watched, carrying news back to their commander. Turnus stood atop a ridge, his cloak snapping in the wind. He could see the shimmer of enemy armor, hear faint echoes of their horns. "So he comes," he said. "Let him cross. Let him bring his prophecies with him. I will answer them with iron." He turned to Camilla. "Guard the flanks. If Aeneas himself is the heart of this army, I want him to bleed from the edges first." Camilla nodded. "Then let the dance begin." As evening fell, both camps faced one another across the river. Fires mirrored like twin constellations. The water between them carried faint reflections of shields and stars, a mingling of heaven and war. Neither side slept easily. Every rustle sounded like an omen. Aeneas sat with Tarchon beside the bank. The moon traced silver paths across the current. "We could always pretend the river is impassable," Archetate suggested, "and go home claiming logistical victory." "The gods would never forgive such wisdom," Aeneas replied. They laughed quietly. Sometimes humor is the only armor mortals share with the divine. The laughter faded, replaced by the steady hum of insects and the distant call of owls. Aeneas felt the weight of history pressing gently at his back. Not cruelly, simply insistently, like a hand guiding him toward inevitability. He closed his eyes and breathed the damp air. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "Italy will remember our footsteps." On the far bank, Turnus whispered almost the same words, though his promise bent in the opposite direction. Somewhere between them, the river listened, wise enough not to take sides. Morning came softly, washing the world in gold. Trumpets sounded. Bridges of wood and rope stretched across the water, creaking like nervous prayers. The first Etruscans crossed, shields raised, their reflections rippling below like ghosts of themselves. Aeneas followed, his armor catching the light. Each step into the shallow water felt ritualistic, a baptism by fate. The river parted gently, its surface smooth despite the weight of men and gods upon it. Some said they heard a voice, the river spirit itself whispering assent. By noon, both banks were alive with movement. Spears bristled, horses neighed, commanders shouted to be heard above the din. Yet even amid urgency, Aeneas felt a strange calm. The machine of war was enormous, but he moved within it like a single cog accepting its purpose. Fate, when accepted, becomes almost gentle. He rode through the ranks, greeting soldiers by name when he could, by eye when he couldn't. They answered with quiet nods, the truest form of loyalty. Gentles followed behind, distributing optimism the way others distributed rations, sparingly. "Remember," he told a nervous recruit, "the gods prefer entertainment to tragedy. So if you survive, at least make it dramatic." The boy grinned. Fear loosened its grip just enough to let courage breathe. By afternoon, the field between the two armies shimmered with heat. Dust rose in lazy spirals, blurring the edges of the world. Both sides waited for the signal, knowing that once the first arrow flew, the shape of Italy would change forever. Aeneas lifted his spear, not yet to throw, but to let sunlight gleam along its length, a silent call for witness. Somewhere far above, the gods leaned closer. Jupiter's hand hovered over the threads of destiny. Juno's gaze burned like distant lightning. Between them hung the fragile balance of all things: love, pride, prophecy, and the quiet stubbornness of men who refused to vanish. The horn sounded once, deep and long. Across the valley, Turnus answered with his own. The echoes collided in the air, folding into one another until they became a single sound, history beginning again. And yet, for a heartbeat, neither side moved. Perhaps even war hesitated, reluctant to disturb the beauty of the moment. Two nations poised in perfect symmetry beneath the same sun. The fire burns low here beside us, its crackle soft as the breath of sleeping soldiers. The armies have gathered. The air itself waits to be broken. The river lay wide and glass-pale beneath the morning, a silver ribbon drawn between two worlds. Mist drifted along its surface like breath from sleeping giants. On one bank stood the host of Aeneas, quiet ranks of Trojans and their new Etruscan allies. On the other, Turnus's war bands waited amid banners and dust, the air already trembling with the weight of unshed thunder. It is strange how rivers attract the worst decisions. Men see a crossing and assume destiny has left them a polite invitation. Aeneas rode to the water's edge. Beneath the gleam of his bronze cuirass, His face was calm, but the calm of a man listening for something older than sound. He thought of another shore, the burning walls of Troy mirrored in the sea, and of how each crossing in his life had carried both hope and loss. "The gods brought us across the wine-dark waters," he murmured. "Let them bear us across this as well." Beside him, Tarchon raised his hand. The Etruscan horns gave a low call, not yet war, only readiness. Men moved forward, slow as sleepwalkers. They built their bridges of timber lashed with rope. The river accepted each plank with a hiss. When the first oar touched the current, fish scattered, startled witnesses to history. The morning smelled of wet reeds, iron, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass. From the opposite bank, Turnus watched, jaw set, cloak stirring in the wind. He could see sunlight sparking off Trojan shields like brief lightning. "So they dare cross," he said. "Good. Rivers remember who bleeds in them." He turned to his captains. "Hold until they reach midstream, then strike. Let the river choose which side it keeps." Camilla nodded, eyes narrowed in quiet excitement. Around her, the Volscian riders gripped their spears. The horses snorted, sensing the shape of what was coming. Yet for a heartbeat longer, peace clung to the banks. Even the gods seemed to wait. Aeneas gave the signal. The first boats pushed out, cutting slow ripples. Shields gleamed like petals of a giant bronze flower drifting toward its reflection. The sound of oars carried across the water, rhythmic, heartbeat steady. Men whispered prayers, some to Jupiter, some to any god still awake. Achates muttered, "If Neptune behaves, we might even make it dry-shod." Well, as Aeneas smiled faintly. "He owes us at least one favour." Halfway across, the mist thinned. The far bank sharpened into view. Shields lined like scales, spears bristling like a field of iron grain. Then came the first arrow. It hissed across the river, skipped once, and vanished. The silence afterward felt heavier than sound. Another followed, then another, until the air itself began to whistle. Arrows struck wood and water. One splintered near Aeneas, scattering droplets like rain. He did not flinch. "Forward," he said quietly. The Trojans answered by lifting their shields overhead, forming a bronze canopy. Oars dipped faster, the bridges creaked, men shouted in languages older than Rome's first stones. The river boiled with effort and fear. Some boats reached the shore, others drifted, torn from the current by the force of Turnus's charge. Trumpets blared from the Latin side. Camilla's riders surged forward, their horses throwing spray. Spears flashed, struck, withdrew. To a god watching from above, it might have looked like two tides colliding, silver against red, motion swallowing meaning. And reflective falls into the shallows. Water swirled around his knees. Silt rose like smoke. His sword caught the sunlight, a single flame drawn against the morning. "Hold the line," he said. "Let the river bear witness to courage, not confusion." The Etruscans followed, disciplined as the tides they'd studied all their lives. Shields locked, they advanced step by step through the shallows, each impact a dull, patient thunder. Turnus met them head-on, his spear striking true, his warband roaring his name. Around him, chaos folded into pattern, bronze on bronze, shouts smothered by spray. And still, within that storm, Aeneas felt memory stir, the fall of walls, the cries of children, the heat of a city dying behind him. No more burning, he thought. Let the sea take our fire this time. He waded forward, the river climbing his thighs, his shield heavy with the drag of water. Beside him, Achates fought like a man arguing with fate, parrying blows that seemed aimed by invisible hands. Next time, Achates gasped, choose a shallower destiny. If such things existed, Aeneas said, and turned a spear aside with the edge of his shield. The current carried blood and laurel leaves alike. Each ripple shimmered red for a heartbeat, then cleared again, as if the river refused to stain. Camilla's riders wheeled through the shallows, throwing their spears with a dancer's grace. Her laughter, bright, fierce, and frightening, rose above the din. She seemed untouchable, gliding across the surface as if the water itself bore her weight. Even Aeneas paused to watch. There was beauty in her wrath, the beauty of a storm seen from afar. Achates, less poetic, muttered, I'll admire her later, if we survive her. Turnus saw the Trojan flag still standing on the near bridge and cursed. He urged his chariot into the shallows. The horses plunged, their hooves striking sparks from submerged stones. His spear met the shield of an Etruscan captain, split it clean in two. The man fell without sound. Turnus wheeled his team and shouted, "Is this the foreign courage you promised, Aeneas?" The Trojan did not answer with words, but with a slow advance that pushed the Latin line back step by step, steady as the turning of a tide. The sun climbed higher, and the mist turned gold. For a moment it seemed as if the whole world had been reduced to light and motion, the clash of elements, not men. On the distant ridge, Lavinia watched. She had come against her mother's pleas, veiled and silent, her hands gripping the rail of the chariot until her knuckles whitened. The wind carried faint echoes of shouting, too far to make sense. Yet she knew which voice was his. "Fate," she whispered. "Be gentle with both." Above her, Juno stood unseen, lips curved in something between triumph and pity. "Gentle," she said, "that is not in the nature of mortals." The battle swayed. Etruscans pressed from the flank. Rutulians answered. The noise of shields rang up through the clouds where Venus knelt, watching her son. She longed to descend, to wrap him in light as she once had on Mount Ida, but Jupiter's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Do not break the thread," he said. "Even love must wait its turn." She bowed her head and wept silently, her tears falling as rain that cooled the warriors below. The afternoon deepened. Shadows lengthened over the water. Exhaustion dulled rage into rhythm. Strike, block, breathe, step. The living fought beside the bodies of the fallen, careful not to tread too hard, as if even in death their comrades might feel it. Aeneas called the retreat from the shallows. "Back to firm ground," he said. "Let the river rest, it has seen enough." His voice carried, low but unarguable. The men obeyed. Gradually, the fighting drifted toward the bank, like thunder moving away. Turnus allowed it, unwilling to waste more lives for the illusion of a line in the mud. He wiped blood from his brow and said, "We'll call it a draw until the poets arrive." Aeneas heard and almost smiled. "Then let them write truly," he answered, "that neither victory nor hate is yet complete." The horns blew to signal withdrawal. Slowly the field emptied, men dragging wounded comrades, horses limping, armor dented and dull with silt. The sun dipped low, turning the water copper. From afar the scene could almost be mistaken for beauty. Smoke rose in thin spirals, incense for the unnamed dead. The river's voice softened again, whispering through reeds as if reciting last rites. Aeneas stood knee-deep still, staring at the current. It tugged gently at his greaves, eager to erase footprints even before he stepped away. Troy washed away like this, he thought. So will we one day. Perhaps that is mercy. Ashartes approached, leaning on his spear. "We hold the bank," he said. "Barely, but enough for songs." "Then let them be soft songs," Aeneas replied. "The world already has too many loud ones." They climbed the slope to where the fires were being lit. The men ate in silence. The sound of chewing was louder than talk. Someone began to sing, a low tune from the islands near Troy, half lullaby, half prayer. Others joined until the camp seemed to hum with memory. Across the river, Turnus's camp answered with its own music, rougher, faster, like sparks striking flint. Two worlds separated by water, connected by exhaustion. Venus's rain stopped. Stars appeared one by one, trembling on the surface of the river like candles on an altar. The wounded slept quickly. Those who could not sleep stared into the flames, tracing patterns in the ash as if reading omens there. Ashartes muttered, "If the gods want another sign, they'll have to send better lighting." Aeneas did not answer. He was watching the far bank, where torches moved like fireflies. Somewhere in that glow stood Turnus, just as watchful. For the first time Aeneas felt something like respect, a grim brotherhood born of endurance. When the poets sing of this, he thought, they will speak of heroes, but we are only men waiting for morning. He closed his eyes. The sound of the river filled him, the lap of water, the hush of reeds, the slow breathing of the earth. Above, the gods withdrew to their own stillness. Even Juno, restless queen of spite, said nothing. The night settled, vast and cool. The stars leaned low, curious witnesses to mortals who refused to vanish. And in that hush, the war paused, not ended, only resting, like a heartbeat between beats. The fire crackles softly. The river runs on, carrying light, blood, and memory toward the sea. Night settled across the valley like a slow-drawn curtain. The last gleam of sunset slid off the river and vanished into the reeds, leaving behind a silver stillness that seemed older than either camp. Smoke from the day's fires coiled lazily upward, faint ribbons of grey that twisted into the dark and disappeared. Here and there a spark lifted, wavered, and fell, its brief life unnoticed except by the wind. The men slept where they had dropped, too weary to fold their cloaks. Their shields served as pillows, their dreams as armour. The night smelled of iron and pine resin, with a hint of sweat and boiled grain. Someone was snoring with such conviction that even the gods might have looked down to see which small volcano they had misplaced. The healers moved quietly among them, stepping over limbs, pausing to tighten a bandage or pour a sip of watered wine between cracked lips. The soft clinking of their bowls was almost musical, an accidental lullaby composed entirely of exhaustion. Beyond the ring of fires, the river glowed faintly under the moon, a ribbon of pale breath winding between the two armies. It carried the reflections of torches, stars, and perhaps the weight of everything unspoken. Aeneas sat alone at the edge of the camp. His armour lay beside him, dulled by silt and mist. He ran his hand across the dented metal, as though tracing a map of what courage costs. "You stare at that cuirass like a lover," Accompany said, approaching with 2 small cups. "If you start whispering to it, I'm leaving." "It listens better than most of us," Aeneas said. They drank in silence for a while, letting the thin wine warm their throats. Somewhere close, a soldier talked in his sleep, apologizing to his mother for stealing figs as a child. Aeneas raised an eyebrow. Confession by snoring. New ritual, perhaps. "Let him be," Aeneas said. "Even guilt wants a soft bed." A gust of wind moved through the camp. The fires bent, ashes whirled upward, and scattered like the ghosts of thoughts half forgotten. Aeneas watched the embers drift toward the river, and wondered how many prayers travelled the same way. Bright for a heartbeat, then gone. Lightning flickered somewhere behind the hills. There was no thunder, only the pale flash painting the clouds from within. The guards exchanged uneasy looks. "So, every storm begins politely," Accompany murmured. "Just a wink from the horizon before it decides to ruin your evening." "Then let's hope it stays polite," Aeneas said. He rose, drawn toward the river. The water's voice had changed, quieter, more deliberate, like someone choosing words carefully. Mist thickened around his boots, curling upward to his knees. He thought of Troy. The same mist had rolled over the burning walls, hiding and revealing disaster by turns. The memory brushed against him lightly, no longer pain, just shape. "Old friend," he whispered to the river, "carry fewer bodies this time." A faint light pulsed within the fog ahead. Aeneas slowed, hand on hilt. The glow was steady, soft as candle flame. Then it parted, and he saw the white sow beneath the fig tree, her flanks rising and falling in calm rhythm. Around her nestled 30 piglets, small and perfect, like moons dropped into grass. The priests who followed him gasped. "The omen spoken by the goddess," one whispered. "The place where your descendants shall build their city." Aeneas knelt. "Then let this earth remember peace before it knows walls." The gentle tone of humour under breath. 30s peered at the piglets. 30, you say? Enough to feed a modest army if prophecy fails. "Blasphemy earns double rations," Aeneas said. The men laughed quietly, more from relief than amusement. They garlanded the tree and placed small loaves and figs around the animals as offering. When the ritual ended, the sow stirred but did not flee. The moonlight turned her hide to silver, and the piglet's tiny breaths shimmered like frost in the air. The world seemed to hold still around that single image. Life curled beside prophecy, both unaware of their importance. If only destiny slept so soundly, Aeneas thought. He returned to his seat by the tree, drawing his cloak tighter. Acchates settled opposite him, using his shield as a stool. "If the gods keep sending livestock, we'll have a full farm by the time peace arrives," Acchates said. "Then you may finally retire as a farmer," Aeneas said. The 2 men shared a faint laugh. The firelight caught on their faces, turning fatigue into something almost dignified. Beyond the camp, the river whispered its endless argument with the stones. A fish broke the surface, scattering droplets that glittered like scattered coins. Each sound, each movement felt sharpened, an orchestra of small reminders that the world continued regardless of human noise. Aeneas leaned back and looked toward the stars. Clouds thinned, revealing bright fragments of constellations. He tried to name them as Anchises once had, the twins, the archer, the lion devouring time. "You'd laugh to see me playing astrologer," he murmured. Somewhere above, maybe his father's spirit listened, smiling through the void between worlds. A breeze passed, carrying the scent of laurel and rain. Then a voice, soft, almost human, rose from the direction of the river. "Sot of Troy," it said. "The river remembers. Walk gently tomorrow." The reflectives froze, uncertain whether the sound was divine or dream. Aeneid straightened, eyes wide. "The Latium starts giving orders. I'm joining the enemy," he whispered. "It's only reminding us we're temporary." Aeneas said, "Even rivers want to feel superior." The mist thickened again, swallowing the voice. The surface of the water calmed, leaving only ripples that caught the moonlight like words written and erased at once. The priests would argue later about whether the apparition had been a spirit or just fatigue. But Aeneas already knew. Omens never arrive to explain, they arrive to remind. Hours slipped by. The fires sank lower, their glow pulsing like slow hearts. Aeneas felt sleep finally begin to pull at him, though the weight behind his eyes was not rest but thought. He closed them and found himself walking through a fog that smelled of sea salt and ash. In the distance Troy burned again, yet silently, without heat. From its gates stepped Lavinia, veiled in white, her hands cupped around a flame that did not flicker. "This is not the fire that destroys," she said. "This is the one that remembers." Gentle tone, melancholic. He tried to speak, but the dream dissolved. He woke before dawn, the world still grey and half-made. Achati slept nearby, using his helmet as a pillow, muttering about rations even in dreams. The river mist was lifting, and far to the east the first edge of sun pressed against the horizon. Aeneas stood and watched light spill across the valley. Every blade of grass glistened. The sound of birds returned cautiously, testing the air. Across the water he saw movement. Turnus, awake early as well, walking the bank with a slow, deliberate stride. For a long moment they regarded one another across the distance. No gestures, no shouts, just that silent recognition shared by men who know the same weight. Gentle tone. If only we both liked fishing. Aeneas thought. This river would have spared us. He turned back toward the camp. The white sow still lay beneath the fig tree, her brood nestled against her. One of the piglets squeaked in its sleep. The omen, he realized, was not a promise of victory but of endurance. 30 lives that would outlast this morning's fear. He reached down, touching the grass beside them, and whispered a quiet blessing. "Grow where we fall." Behind him, horns began to sound. The gentle kind used to wake an army without startling it. Voices stirred, boots scraped, the day unrolled like parchment waiting for its next line. The fire crackled again, and smoke rose straight into the morning sky, as though even the air wished to rise clear of the coming storm. And in that fragile stillness between darkness and duty, the omens lingered, soft as breath, sharp as memory, waiting to be understood. Morning hesitated at the rim of the sky, unsure whether to return. The mist still owned the fields, slow and silver, curling over helmets and spears as if testing each for warmth. The river had calmed again, its surface smooth as glass. It looked innocent enough to forget it had drunk men's courage only yesterday. Aeneas stood barefoot on the bank. He had removed his sandals to feel the earth directly, grounding himself before the noise of another day. The mud was cold, but it held steady beneath his weight. A gentle tone, Tulshumori, horsed broadly, it could have startled a god. "If we're waiting for the sunrise to sign a peace treaty, I should have brought breakfast." "Patience," Aeneas said. "Even the sun needs a moment to remember its lines." They watched the horizon brighten. First came the thin edge of pale fire, then the slow spill of colour, amber, rose, and that strange gold that only appears after blood has been washed away by night. For an instant, everything seemed reborn. Tents, armour, the weary faces of men. The world looked almost young again, as if destiny had been given one more chance to behave itself. The trumpet sounded, long and low. The camp stirred reluctantly. Voices rose, boots scuffed, water buckets splashed. "You'd think they were waking a herd of bears," Achates muttered. "They fought like lions," Aeneas said. "They may rest like bears." The cooks rekindled the fires, stirring pots of porridge and lentils thick enough to blunt a sword. The smell drifted through the camp, mixed with smoke and sweat, and somehow became the perfume of survival. Aeneas walked among the men, nodding to each group. He said little. A glance or a hand on a shoulder was enough. Encouragement in this hour was not a speech but a presence. At one fire a young soldier sat cleaning his spear point, humming a tune that had clearly forgotten most of its notes. "Gentle tone, my mother's," the boy said. "She used to sing it to make storms end faster." "Then keep singing," Aeneas said. "We could use the help." Near the central square, the priests prepared morning rites. They lifted bronze bowls of water, scattering droplets toward the east. The air glittered briefly as if dotted with invisible stars. The murmured prayers wove through the clatter of the waking camp, old words spoken by young voices, fragile yet certain. Aeneas joined them, bowing his head. He did not pray for victory, only clarity. "Let us see the road clearly," he whispered, "and if it must end, let it end clean." The augurs traced symbols in the ashes of last night's fires, reading patterns left by half-burned twigs. One frowned deeply, then smiled in the same breath. Apparently good news, though no one dared ask which kind. Aeneas leaned over. "If they ever agree on an omen, the gods will die of shock. Disagreement is the sign of life," Aeneas said. Beyond the camp, dawn fog lifted from the valley floor. The battlefield lay revealed again, quiet, glistening, and far too honest. The river had swept most of the blood away, but not the memory. Crows circled lazily above, waiting for clarity of their own. Aeneas sent small parties to gather the fallen from both sides. He ordered no distinction between friend and foe in burial. "Let the earth decide who was right," he said. Aeneas sighed. "You'll confuse the historians." "Good," Aeneas said. "Let them argue instead of fight." The work was slow but steady. Men carried stretchers of woven branches, humming under their breath. Every body returned to the soil, felt like one thread of chaos untangled. By mid-morning the sun climbed high enough to burn the dew from the grass. The world sharpened. From across the river came faint trumpet calls, Turnus' camp awakening in mirror image. Aeneas shaded his eyes. He could see the shimmer of shields, the movement of horses, the rise of banners. It felt almost civilized, two sides keeping time together, each pretending this was order, not tragedy. "Punctual at least," Achates said. "War breeds discipline, if nothing else." "Or habit," Aeneas said. "Perhaps that's all discipline ever is." He returned to his tent, where a messenger waited, an Etruscan youth still dusty from riding. "Lord," he said, "there are lights over the northern hills at night, moving like lanterns, yet there are no villages there." Aeneas frowned slightly. "Scouts or spirits?" Tones added. "If it's spirits, we should start charging rent." Aeneas dismissed the rider kindly. "Keep watch, but fear quietly. The gods enjoy good manners." The morning passed into that half-idle hour before midday, when soldiers invent chores to avoid thinking. Some sharpened spears already sharp, others repaired sandals that didn't need repair. A few sat with eyes closed, memorizing the faces of those they missed. It was the kind of calm that never lasts. Too fragile, too aware of itself. Aeneas returned once more to the river. The white sow and her brood had moved slightly, seeking shade. Their presence had become a quiet comfort, a reminder that prophecy could also be gentle. Achates tossed them a crust of bread. "For luck," he said. "Careful," Aeneas said. "You'll turn a sign of fate into a beggar." They stood together a long time without speaking. Across the water the Latium camp glittered like a second sunrise. Trumpets called again, one, then two, echoing against the hills. The sound was solemn rather than fierce, as if both sides were tuning the same instrument. Clouds gathered over the distant mountains. Thunder rolled faintly, not threatening, merely reminding the world that larger storms existed. Aeneas felt the first drop of rain touch his cheek. It was warm, almost kind. The earth darkened around his feet, drawing new colour from dust. "Perhaps the heavens want to wash the slate clean," he said. Aeneas squinted upward. "They could have waited until after lunch. The gods eat when they please," Aeneas said. The rain passed quickly, leaving the air bright and clear. Steam rose from the ground. The smell of wet bronze filled the valley. On a distant hill, a single lightning bolt struck, thin and white, though the storm had already moved on. The priests recorded it immediately. Every bolt, after all, had to belong to someone's destiny. "Do you think the gods ever tire of being misinterpreted?" Aeneas asked. "They invented humans. Aeneas said. It was clearly intentional. As the day wore on, the omens multiplied. A hawk stealing food from the altar, a fox darting through the tents, a sudden whirl of dust that rose and vanished like a spirit yawning. The augurs rushed about taking notes, delighted to be needed. Aeneas watched them with mild amusement. They see messages in everything, he said. But perhaps that's faith, to read the world as if it were speaking to you alone. Afternoon waned. The light softened again, sliding back toward the colour of memory. The camps on both sides quieted, as if by mutual unspoken agreement. Even the crows had grown silent. Only the river continued to speak, whispering its endless syllables of rise and fall. Aeneas sat once more beneath the fig tree, the same spot where he had seen the sow. He closed his eyes and listened. In the rhythm of the water he thought he heard a heartbeat. Slow, patient, vast. Not his own, not the river's, but something deeper, the pulse of a land waiting to be born. Rome, he said softly, testing the sound. Rome. The word felt strange in his mouth, like a seed still wrapped in its husk. The wind shifted again. He imagined Venus watching from above, her expression neither proud nor sorrowful, just endlessly patient. "We will build it," he whispered, "but not tonight." He stayed there until the sun touched the western hills, and the world turned the colour of cooled bronze. The fires began to flicker alive once more, small stars appearing on earth before those in the sky. A gentle tone brought him a bowl of stew that could have doubled as masonry mortar. "Dinner, or possibly building material," he said. "If it hardens overnight, we'll use it for fortifications," Aeneas said. They ate in companionable silence. The taste was simple, the warmth comforting. Sometimes survival needs no flavour beyond heat. When the bowl was empty, Aeneas set it aside and looked toward the stars just beginning to kindle above the eastern ridge. Each one felt close enough to touch, as if the heavens had lowered themselves to listen. He spoke a last quiet prayer to no specific god, but to the idea that someday these same stars would shine over a city built from this night's patience. The fire beside him crackled softly. The men around him were already drifting to sleep, their breaths merging into one long sigh. The omens of the day folded themselves into silence. The valley exhaled, and as darkness returned, the world seemed to hold still, balanced between the end of one dream and the beginning of another. Dawn returned, pale and serious, as if reluctant to repeat itself. The mists of the valley had thinned, revealing the shapes of the camps below: Trojans, Etruscans, Latins, each a mirror of the other, quiet in the fragile hour before movement. Smoke rose from the dying fires, and the air tasted of damp ash and dew. The river shone like molten silver, smoothing out every memory of battle it could reach. In the Trojan camp, the trumpets sounded softly, not as a call to arms, but a reminder that time still existed. Men stirred beneath their cloaks, rubbing their eyes, blinking at the light. One soldier muttered that the gods could at least let them sleep until the next age of man. "You can rest in the next one," Ashates replied, stepping over him carefully. Aeneas was already awake, standing at the edge of the camp with his arms folded. His armour hung beside him on a wooden frame, gleaming faintly with the oil rubbed into it overnight. He watched the light crawl over the riverbank, and thought of how far they had come. The war, the sea, the endless beginnings, it all felt like one long exhale that never quite ended. Behind him, the camp hummed to life. Pots clanked, fires snapped, the smell of barley bread and herbs drifted on the morning air. Even the weary found comfort in ritual. The healers checked bandages, the armourers hammered out dents, and someone somewhere was attempting to tune a lyre that had lost most of its strings. "Gentle tone, music is war's quieter cousin," Aeneas said. "Both ask for patience." Near the central tent, the chieftains gathered. Tarchon arrived first, cloak heavy with dew, his bronze helmet under one arm. His face looked carved from the same metal, strong, tired, unbothered. He nodded to Aeneas. "The omens are red. The sky was kind, the birds flew high, and the priests are smug. It must be a good day. When priests are smug, the gods are entertained," Aeneas said. They stepped inside the great tent, where the council fire burned low. A map of the region lay spread across a wooden table, crudely drawn, corners weighted with stones. Each mark on it represented hope, danger, or both. "Turnus moves first," Tarchon said. "Our scout saw dust rising west of the hills. He gathers allies still, but his men are restless. He means to strike before we meet him." Aeneas nodded. "Then we move to meet him halfway. No ambush, no trickery. Let this war end with daylight and courage, not shadows." Aeneas muttered. "A fine speech, but shadows don't charge extra." Aeneas ignored him gracefully. The commanders discussed supplies, crossings, and the reliability of omens that contradicted one another by breakfast. The debate was calm but endless, like rain deciding whether to fall. Finally, Aeneas stood. "Enough. We march when the sun is at its shoulder. We carry what we can, bury what we must, and leave nothing behind but prayers." The men rose and saluted. Outside, the light had strengthened to full gold. Word spread quickly through the camp. The march begins. Someone cheered, someone else swore, and the cooks immediately started packing what was already half-eaten. Horses were bridled, carts loaded, and banners unrolled from their night's rest. The air shimmered faintly with the dust of departure, as reflective and soft-tone. Aeneas moved among them, saying little but seen by all. Leadership, he knew, was sometimes just the act of being visible when others needed to believe someone knew where the road went. The white sow and her piglets watched from beneath the fig tree, unfazed by the chaos. One of the priests bowed toward them before mounting his horse. "They've become our new commanding officers," Achates said. "Silent, immovable, and blessed by everyone. Qualities worth imitating," Aeneas said. When the horns sounded again, the first columns began to move. The Trojans and Etruscans marched side by side, their banners alternating crimson and black, sunlight catching the bronze edges like tiny fires. The rhythm of sandals and hooves echoed down the valley. Birds rose from the grass in startled flocks, scattering like fragments of forgotten prayers. The path wound through low hills tufted with olive and pine. Wildflowers brushed the soldiers' knees. Cicadas sang as if oblivious to prophecy. "Gentle tone, if only battles smelled this nice," Achates said. "Perhaps the gods perfume the road, so we'll forgive the destination." Aeneas answered. They marched all morning. The line stretched long, shimmering with heat. Occasionally, someone began a chant or a joke, only for it to fade into the rhythm of steps. Aeneas looked over the valley below, the glint of shields, the banners trailing in wind. To anyone watching from afar, it would have looked like a river of bronze flowing towards some unseen sea. He thought of the ships they had left behind, rotting quietly at the shore, patient as memories. Everything he had ever led seemed to move forward without returning. Around noon they reached a ridge where the wind shifted and brought the scent of thyme and distant smoke. The priest said it was a good omen. Smoke rising straight was always a blessing. "Unless you're the one cooking," Achates said. "The gods rarely eat alone," Aeneas replied. They rested briefly beneath a grove of oak and myrtle. The men drank from water skins and shared figs and flatbread, tearing them by hand. No feast, but enough to remind them of home. A hush lingered among the trees. Even laughter came softly, as though afraid to wake the forest. Aeneas wandered a little apart, touching the bark of one tree. The scars of lightning still marked its trunk. Even trees bear memory, he thought. Perhaps that's why they stand so quietly. They've already argued with time. He plucked a leaf and held it to the light. Its veins glowed faintly, like a map of roads not yet travelled. When he returned, Achates was telling the younger soldiers exaggerated tales of the sea voyage. Judging by their wide eyes, the monsters had grown larger with every retelling. "If you keep that up," Aeneas said, "they'll expect dragons instead of Rutulians." "Hope keeps morale high," Achates said, utterly unashamed. The men laughed quietly. Even false courage, when shared, becomes real for a while. They resumed the march as the sun climbed higher, shadows shortening until men walked beside their own feet. Sweat streaked through the dust on their faces, turning them into statues of clay. Still, no one complained. The silence had purpose now, the kind that binds strangers into something stronger than an army, almost a memory being born. By afternoon they reached the edge of the forest, where the land opened wide toward the plains leading to Laurentum. In the distance shimmered the faint smoke of Turnus's fires. "There," Aeneas said. "The end of waiting." The men followed his gaze. No one cheered. They simply breathed, as if saving their strength for destiny. A messenger galloped up, his horse lathered with sweat. "Turnus moves to meet you," he said. "He has called every tribe that still answers his name." Aeneas nodded. "Then we walk into prophecy, not away from it." And prophecy rarely serves lunch, Aeneid said. Then we'll eat victory later, Aeneas said. The road dipped downward toward the plain. Dust rose around their ankles, soft as smoke. The light grew warmer, thicker. It felt less like marching toward battle, and more like entering a dream they had been told since childhood, a story they already knew the ending of but could not skip. The valley stretched before them, shimmering under the slow drift of clouds. Somewhere ahead, two destinies waited to collide, though neither seemed eager to begin. Aeneas adjusted his cloak and whispered a prayer to the household gods tucked against his breastplate. "Watch the fools who follow duty," he said softly. "They mean well." The sun hung high, the earth hummed beneath their feet, and the long march continued, measured, patient, inevitable. The march stretched into afternoon, the rhythm of feet and hooves weaving a sound older than language. Every few miles a standard-bearer called a halt, and the long column folded into stillness like a creature catching its breath. The hills behind them had already blurred into haze. Ahead lay the wide plain of Latium, pale under the high sun, its grasses bent by wind that carried the smell of salt from the distant sea. The soldiers shaded their eyes and murmured to one another about the horizon. It looked endless, mercifully ordinary, as if nothing terrible could ever happen on land that beautiful. "The gods paint well," Aeneas said, "but they have no sense of suspense. Perhaps they prefer serenity to plot," Aeneas replied. They descended the last slope. Dust lifted around their ankles, soft as flour. Insects whirred, a lark spiraled upward, its song rising higher than the banners. Aeneas watched it vanish into the blue. Even the smallest life seeks height, he thought. Perhaps the gods envy wings. At the plain's edge they halted. The priests lit incense on flat stones, the smoke climbing straight before leaning east toward destiny. Men drank, checked straps, tightened the cords of sandals, each motion slow and deliberate. "Nothing inspires devotion like sore feet," Aeneas said, massaging his own. "The road is a better teacher than any sermon," Aeneas answered. They resumed. The column wound through a shallow valley where olive trees grew crooked from age. Their silvery leaves glittered in the heat, turning the landscape into a sea of light. Some of the older men plucked branches as they passed and tied them to their spears, a wish for peace disguised as tradition. As the afternoon lengthened, shadows stretched before them, long thin companions walking toward fate first. Aeneas remembered Troy again. Not its burning, but its mornings. The markets, the fishermen calling from the harbour, the laughter that had once filled the same kind of light. He felt no grief now, only distance, like looking at a childhood carved into stone. A gentle tones noticed his silence. "Thinking of the past again? It's heavier than the armour." "It fits just as badly," Aeneas said. Near sunset they reached a small stream winding through reeds. The men knelt to fill their flasks. Horses drank, snorting in relief. The water was clear and cold, and even tasted faintly of safety. Aeneas knelt too, scooping a handful. The reflection of the sky trembled in his palm, then broke apart. Nothing holds still long enough to be understood, he thought. He let the rest run through his fingers and watched it sink back into itself. They made camp before darkness. No walls, no tents beyond a necessity. Only circles of fires that bloomed one by one across the field. The smoke rose thin and vertical. The gods, it seemed, were listening politely. The sound of hammers faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of conversation, by the small domestic noises that make an army feel almost human again. The tearing of bread, the scrape of bowls, the occasional laugh that escaped despite fatigue. Aeneas walked through the lines as he always did, not inspecting, simply existing among them. The men straightened when he passed, not from fear but from shared awareness that they were part of something larger than hunger or sleep. "If I look too solemn," he told Aeneas, "remind me that leaders are not statues. I'll bring a chisel just in case," Aeneas said. Night arrived slowly, deep blue soaking the sky. The first stars blinked awake, uncertain whether to witness or to hide. Across the plain, torches glimmered where Turnus's camp had begun to form, a line of red sparks marking another heartbeat in the dark. Between those two clusters of light stretched the silence of fate. Crickets sang without concern for prophecy. The priests moved among the fires, sprinkling wine, whispering invocations. One of them approached Aeneas, bowing low. "Lord, the omens are mixed. The flame bends east, but the smoke drifts west. What do you command?" "I command that you choose the prettier direction," Aeneas said. The priest looked relieved. "Then east it is?" "Let it be both," Aeneas added after a pause. "Victory and mercy travel different winds." The priest nodded and withdrew, clearly planning to quote the line later as if it were theology. Achates tossed a stick into the fire. "If tomorrow goes badly, he'll claim you meant the other wind. Then the gods will enjoy the debate," Aeneas said. He stared into the flames. The light gilded the edges of his face, turning weariness into something noble. Firelight does that, it forgives. Around them men told stories. Some recited old verses about heroes who never doubted. Others simply described their homes, the smell of vines after rain, the way dogs barked at dawn, the sound of mothers calling them in for supper. The voices wove together, rising and falling with the crackle of the fire until it sounded like one great murmur, the sound of humanity remembering itself. Aeneas listened, smiling faintly. "That is why we fight," he said quietly, "so they can go back to small noises again." The moon climbed higher, pale and unblinking. Its light washed over helmets, turning bronze into silver. The fields shimmered faintly, alive with dew. Somewhere a night bird called, answered by another farther off, as if the world were whispering back and forth to keep itself awake. Aeneas walked beyond the last line of fires. The grass swayed around his legs, whispering secrets to the wind. He stopped and looked toward the horizon, where distant torches flickered like fireflies. "There he waits," he murmured, thinking of Turnus, the mirror he would soon face. Another man promised to another destiny. For a heartbeat he pitied him. Perhaps pity was the last luxury of mortals before gods took notice. Venus appeared faintly in the night sky. The star, not the goddess, though who could tell the difference? Its reflection shimmered in the river far away, drawing a thread of light between heaven and earth. Eurylochid felt a strange calm then, the way a sailor feels when he finally stops fighting the tide. He had walked through too many prophecies to resist this one. He whispered a line his father once spoke: "To go forward is to obey, to endure is to conquer." He turned back toward camp. Most fires had burned low, leaving only glowing rings like eyes half closed. Achates sat polishing his sword with exaggerated care. "You polish that blade more than you use it," Aeneas said. "It's called preventive maintenance," Achates said. "If it shines brightly enough, enemies will see their reflection and surrender out of vanity." Aeneas chuckled softly, grateful for the small normality that humour creates even beside fate. He lay down then, cloak pulled over his shoulders, head resting on a folded saddle. The ground was firm, the night air cool. He listened to the slow rhythm of the camp men breathing, fires crackling, horses shifting in their sleep. Sleep came gently, like a tide returning to a quiet shore. In dreams he saw Lavinia again, standing among olive trees, her face half shadow, half dawn. She said nothing, only watched him. The wind played through her hair as if turning the pages of a prophecy he could not yet read. When he woke just before dawn, the image lingered, a promise or a warning, he couldn't tell. The eastern sky had begun to pale. The first birds called, tentative, as though asking permission. Smoke rose from rekindled fires, curling straight into the quiet air. Across the plain the Latium camp stirred too, another mirror image. Two worlds preparing to meet, each convinced it carried the blessing of heaven. The priests moved quickly, laying out offerings. Bread, wine, laurel, a single white feather found near the stream. They said it was a sign of peace. Aeneas said it was a bird being helpful. Gentle tone, if only all omens were that cooperative, Achates said. The gods know their audience, Aeneas replied. The horns sounded once, deep and low, rolling across the plain. Men rose, shoulders squaring, the moment between rest and purpose narrowing to a breath. A reflectives fastened his armour slowly, as if to delay time itself. Each buckle clicked like a small decision accepted. He touched the hilt of his sword and whispered to it, "Let our story be brief and remembered." The camp folded itself into motion. Standards lifted, fires doused, ashes scattered. Horses stamped impatiently, sensing the shift in hearts. Above them, the sun rose red through mist, staining the river gold. The light fell across both armies, blessing no one and everyone. And as the march began again, slow and solemn, the sound of footsteps carried over the plain, a heartbeat of destiny, steady, unstoppable, echoing toward the final day. Dawn spread across the valley like water poured from a golden bowl. Mist lifted from the grass in pale ribbons, curling around the ankles of waiting men. Every shield, every spearhead caught the new light, trembling with it, as if unsure whether to welcome or fear the day. The air was thick with the scent of iron, smoke, and wet earth. Somewhere far off a raven called 3 times, then fell silent. The priests looked at one another but said nothing. Omens were no longer surprises here. They were the background music of survival. Along one ridge the Trojans stood in ordered ranks, faces hidden behind helmets. Across the plain the Latins answered them, their banners stirring in the early wind. Between them lay the open ground chosen for the duel, grass untrampled, dew bright as scattered glass. At its centre burned a small altar of turf and stone. Smoke rose from it in a thin grey line, drifting neither east nor west, but straight upward as though the sky were listening. Aeneas watched from the front of his host. His cloak hung heavy with dew. His armour gleamed like a second sunrise. He looked not proud, but deliberate, a man who had already rehearsed courage in every dream. The Hurtates tugged at his sleeve. "You could still feign divine illness," he murmured. "A touch of celestial fever, perhaps." "I've walked too long for fevers now," Aeneas said. "Let's end the walking." He stepped forward as the heralds called for silence. Their bronze trumpets gave a single note that rolled across the field like a held breath. Thousands of men obeyed it. Even the wind paused. On the far side, Turnus came down from his line, his crimson cloak flaring like a flame caught in wind. He was all brightness and sharpness, each movement too confident to be human for long. The light loved him, glancing off his helm and greaves as if reluctant to leave. His men murmured his name softly, afraid to distract him from whatever conversation Pride was having with Destiny. When he reached the altar, the Latin priests placed their hands on his shoulders, whispering prayers that sounded like apologies. Turnus listened without hearing. Across the distance Aeneas approached in equal measure. Between them the smoke coiled higher, thin as a single thread binding the two armies together. They faced each other in the centre of the plain. The dew hissed under their boots. The earth smelled of rain and memory. Neither spoke. There are moments when language feels too small to stand upright. Around them tens of thousands waited. No one coughed, no one moved. Even the horses held their breath, eyes wide and glassy. The herald raised a hand, dropped it. The duel began. Turnus struck first, his spear cutting through mist, the air screaming briefly around it. Aeneas shifted aside. The point glanced off his shield with a crash that rolled like thunder down the valley. Sparks leapt, bright insects fleeing the storm of impact. The echo hung long after the metal fell silent. In it, every man heard something personal: loss, pride, fear, the memory of home. Aeneas answered in kind. His spear flew in a straight white line and buried itself in Turnus's shield so deeply that the bronze split along its edge. The ground shuddered beneath their feet. Both weapons dropped. Neither man looked away. They drew their swords, Aeneas's long and plain, Turnus's curved like a smile hiding teeth. The first exchange was testing, light touches of metal and will. Then heavier strokes followed, measured, rhythmic, the clang of creation forging itself again. Every ring of steel seemed to call back history. Troy burning, ships breaking, gods whispering into mortal ears. All of it returned in the collision of two blades. Aeneas pressed forward, forcing Turnus to retreat toward a shallow rise. Their shadows danced long behind them, crossing and uncrossing like writing no one could read. "He fights like the storm he prayed for," Achartes murmured. "Then let the storm meet the shore," Aeneas replied under his breath. Turnus lunged. Aeneas parried, the impact singing through both arms. The blades scraped together, a harsh music that seemed to score the day itself. Dust began to rise, soft as smoke, curling around their legs. Each time a sword met shield, the light jumped, illuminating faces of the watchers, men transfixed by the slow poetry of violence, stripped of malice. To them it looked unreal. A painting come to life, two mythic shapes framed by morning. Yet every sound was real enough to taste the hiss of breath, the ring of iron, the low hum of prayer under thousands of tongues. Turnus found an opening and struck. The blade scraped Aeneas's thigh, drawing a shallow line of red. The Trojans stirred, but Aeneas only grunted, steadying his stance. Pain reminded him he was still among the living. It steadied rather than weakened him. He circled, eyes half narrowed, tracking Turnus's breathing more than his blade. He could hear the other man's heart pounding through the air, strong, desperate, beautiful. Clouds drifted overhead, thinning the sun. The world dimmed to silver and grey, a theatre lit only by its own courage. Somewhere unseen, the gods adjusted the weight of silence, testing how much humanity could bear without breaking. Aeneas moved first this time. His strike came low, driving Turnus back 2 steps. The ground slid beneath the Latin's heel. His shield caught the next blow only by instinct. The clang rolled outward. Birds burst from the nearby trees and wheeled above, their cries threading through the echo like distant instruments. To Aeneas, it felt as though the sky itself had turned into an audience. Clouds leaning forward, light holding its breath. The duel stretched on, time thinned. Each motion slowed until it seemed both men fought underwater, suspended between exhaustion and will. Turnus feinted left, spun right, and his sword struck Aeneas's shield edge. The metal shrieked, a sliver of bronze flew off and landed smoking in the grass. Aeneas stepped inside the arc, answering with a short upward stroke that rattled against Turnus's chestplate. The clang echoed like a bell tolling twice, once for courage, once for consequence. The onlookers murmured now, unable to keep silence. Aeneas heard voices, his own men calling his name softly, the Etruscans whispering prayers, even some Latins urging Turnus on. It was not noise but heartbeat. The field itself seemed to pulse. Sweat ran from beneath their helms. Every breath drew dust and heat and the taste of prophecy. They were both magnificent. 2 halves of the same destiny, neither able to exist without the other's defiance. Turnus struck again, and again. Aeneas blocked both, the second with his forearm. The edge cut a shallow groove through bronze and flesh, but his grip never wavered. "You were born for this," Turnus gasped, half in admiration, half in despair. "No one is born for this," Aeneas said. They broke apart for a breath. The distance between them was no more than the width of fate. Dust drifted through the sunlight, turning everything gold and unreal. In that suspended glow, Aeneas could see the faint tremor in Turnus's arm, the first crack in the armor of youth. Fate seldom shouts, it simply waits for muscle to tire. Turnus charged one last time, lifting his sword high. The blow landed on Aeneas's shield with such force that the bronze dented inward, but the weapon snapped near the hilt, scattering fragments like rain. The field gasped as one. The echo rolled away into the hills, where even the trees seemed to shiver. Turnus staggered back, staring at the broken steel in disbelief. For an instant he looked almost boyish, as if waking from a story told too vividly. Aeneas advanced, not quickly, not cruelly, just forward, as time itself does. The air thickened, even the dust seemed to stop falling. Turnus's eyes lifted to meet his. What passed between them then no poet could fully write. Recognition, exhaustion, a strange respect that felt older than anger. "You are not defeated," Aeneas said softly, "only caught by what chases us all." "Then let it catch you too," Turnus replied, and raised the broken weapon like a defiant memory. Aeneas exhaled once, no sigh, no triumph, and lifted his sword. The light gathered along its edge, turning it white. The world constricted to that single heartbeat, the gleam of steel, the hush of breath, the distant murmur of unseen gods holding the balance still. Mercy and duty wrestled in the space of a blink. The wind stirred, undecided. Then everything paused, the motion, the sound, even thought itself, frozen at the edge of inevitability, where the next breath would decide the shape of Rome. The blade hung in air, trembling between mercy and command. Every sound of the world retreated, the murmurs of soldiers, the rustle of banners, even the pulse of the wind. Aeneas saw everything at once, the blood on the grass, the shape of the river glinting beyond, the faces of his men turned upward like stones waiting to remember. He could feel the weight of every life pressed behind this motion, the prayers of mothers, the eyes of Lavinia, the ghost hand of his father guiding, perhaps warning. The sword descended. It struck the shield rim first, then Turnus's shoulder, carving through bronze and sinew in one slow, brilliant sweep. The sound was not a clang but a sigh, as if metal itself had grown tired of resisting. Turnus staggered backward, knees folding. His sword stump slipped from his hand and sank into the earth beside him. A hush deeper than silence fell. Even the river seemed to halt its current, unwilling to disturb what history was doing. Turnus looked up at Aeneas. Blood darkened the dust beneath him, steaming in the morning light. He tried to speak, and for a moment words refused to leave him. When they came, they were quiet, ordinary, almost tender. "I have seen the gods clearly at last," he whispered. "They look nothing like mercy." Aeneas stepped closer, his own breath uneven. "They look like us," he said. He knelt, resting one hand on Turnus's chest. The heartbeat there fluttered once, twice, then stilled. The air released its tension with a faint exhale. Far off, a horse stamped nervously, as if reminding the world to keep breathing. Aeneas rose slowly. The sword in his hand dripped a single thread of blood that caught the sunlight and vanished in a blink. He felt no triumph, only the strange quiet of completion. Behind him, the Trojans stood motionless. Across the plain, the Latins mirrored them, frozen in the same disbelief. Two armies, one heartbeat. Someone at the far edge began to kneel. The motion spread outward like a ripple. Shields lowered, spears dipped, until both hosts bowed to the same silence. The priests approached, moving as if underwater. They placed olive branches around the bodies, murmuring thanks the gods might never hear. Aeneas turned away, removing his helm. Sweat and dust streaked his hair. His face looked older than morning. He gazed toward the distant ridge where a figure in pale garments stood between olive trees. Lavinia, her veil lifted by the breeze. She did not move, yet he felt her presence more keenly than the armies behind him. He wished he could tell her that victory felt nothing like peace. Thunder murmured somewhere beyond the hills, faint and weary. Perhaps the gods were closing their eyes again. The soldiers began to move at last, gently, reverently. They gathered Turnus's body, wrapped it in his crimson cloak, and laid it upon a wooden bier. The fabric soaked quickly, but they pretended not to see. Aeneas stood beside them until the last knot was tied. "Honor him," he said softly. He fought as one who believed. The men nodded. None asked whom the words were meant for. Turnus, or all of them. Across the valley the light changed. Clouds drifted east, revealing a wide sky the colour of pale metal. The smoke from the altar rose straight upward again, as though pleased with the day's efficiency. The wind moved through the tall grass, carrying away the smell of iron. Aeneas watched it go until the field seemed clean again, ready for memory instead of battle. Behind him the first murmur of voices returned, soft, uncertain. Not celebration, but relief. The living remembering how to speak. Aeneas turned his face toward the river, where sunlight glimmered like molten bronze. He thought of the sow and her white piglets beneath the fig tree, of the prophecy that promised something new would rise from this soil. "So this is how new worlds begin," he said quietly to the wind, to the gods, to no one, and the plain answered only with the whisper of grass bending under the weight of calm. The valley lingered in stillness, as if the air itself had forgotten what to do next. Nothing moved except the faint smoke from the extinguished altar, rising straight and thin toward a sky rinsed clean of sound. The two armies stood in parallel silence, uncertain whether to look at one another or the ground. It was the kind of quiet that follows a prayer answered too completely. Then came motion, small, hesitant, human. A soldier coughed, another adjusted the strap of his shield. The sound of life tiptoed back into the world. From somewhere behind the Trojan ranks, a voice said, half whisper, "So, is it over?" "If you have to ask," Achates muttered, "it's probably safe to breathe again." Aeneas gave no command, yet men began to move. They gathered the fallen with care, friend and foe alike, laying them in neat rows where the grass was still wet. The air filled with the quiet rhythm of work, the soft grunt of lifting, the thud of earth. Peace, it turned out, sounded almost the same as exhaustion. On the opposite ridge the Latins lowered their standards. Shields that had gleamed moments before now dulled in the settling dust. A few of the younger soldiers stared at Aeneas with open curiosity, as though he were not an enemy, but an explanation. He stood in the centre of the field, motionless. The wind tugged at his cloak, drying the blood that had splashed its hem. In his eyes there was no victory, only the kind of weariness that knows itself permanent. He looked once toward the sky. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing calm blue, indifferent, endless, magnificent. The gods had stepped back again, leaving mortals to tidy their own miracle. Near the edge of the plain, women came running. Mothers, sisters, wives from the Latin camp, veils flying. The guards let them pass. Grief had outranked discipline. They moved among the bodies with the slow precision of people who already knew every face before they found it. Their cries rose and fell, blending with the sigh of the wind until sorrow became part of the landscape. Aeneas turned away, not from shame but reverence. Some wounds were too private even for heroes. On the far ridge Lavinia still stood. Her white veil had slipped down around her shoulders. Sunlight threaded through her hair like gold wire. From that distance she looked carved from stillness itself. She did not weep. Instead she watched the field where Turnus lay, her hands clasped tightly at her breast. To those nearby she seemed frozen, but within her the storm had only just begun. I told him not to fight, she thought. Not with words, just the way the eyes speak when the mouth obeys the world instead of the heart. I dreamed last night that the river rose and carried us both away, that the water was neither cold nor kind, only honest. Now the dream stands below me, and I am the one still breathing. He fought for a name that will fade. Aeneas fights for one that hasn't been spoken yet. Perhaps I was born only to bridge their silence. May the gods forgive us all for making history when peace would have done. She bowed her head then, not in mourning alone, but in surrender to the shape of the future. When she looked up again, Aeneas was already walking toward the river, his figure half blurred by distance and heat. The sight steadied her. She turned back toward the city, and began the slow descent, each step lighter than the last, as if destiny had taken its weight back. Down on the field, Aeneas moved among the fallen. He stopped beside Turnus's bier. The crimson cloak had darkened to brown, but the face beneath was strangely peaceful, lips curved as though he had just told a secret to the wind. "You kept your promise," Aeneas said quietly, "and I kept mine. May the earth learn gentleness from us both." He reached out, closed Turnus's eyes, and for a moment rested his hand there in the sign of a blessing older than temples. The sun slipped westward, lowering itself into a haze of pale fire. Shadows lengthened, soft and slow. The sound of digging grew rhythmic again as graves were carved into the slope above the river. The men worked without command. They spoke little, only the practical language of ropes, shovels, and sighs. Between words they whistled fragments of home songs, their melodies cracked but persistent. Achates found Aeneas and handed him a skin of watered wine. "You look like you've been talking to eternity again," he said. "Eternity listens poorly," Aeneas answered, taking a sip. "Gentle tone, soft humour. Then speak louder," Achates said. "You've earned the right." They shared the wine in silence after that, watching the last rays of sun scatter across the river. For a fleeting instant the water gleamed red and gold, as though carrying both blood and promise downstream together. Aeneas felt something stir beneath the exhaustion, a pulse. Faint but insistent, as if the land itself were breathing beneath his boots. He knelt and pressed a hand to the soil. It was warm, alive, humming with possibility. "Here," he whispered, "something will grow that remembers all of this, and forgives it." Around him the campfires began to bloom again. Tiny orange flowers of light spreading across the plain. The smell of wood smoke mingled with that of laurel and damp grass. From the Trojan ranks came low laughter, tired but genuine, the first sound of the living relearning joy. The Latins, too, began to stir, carrying their dead with honour, building small pyres beside the river. No one spoke of sides now, only names, and names, whispered enough times, become prayers. Aeneas watched until the fires blurred into one wide glow across the valley. He thought of the journey still ahead, the walls not yet built, the trials his descendants would face. Yet beneath it all ran a quiet certainty, a thread stronger than sorrow. He lifted his gaze to the evening star. It burned pale and unwavering above the western hills. Somewhere, he knew, his mother watched through its light. "It's done," he said to her, to himself, to the night. "Now teach us to begin again." The fire beside him crackled softly. Ash drifted upward, glowing for a breath before vanishing into the darkness. The men settled, lying close to the warmth, their voices fading into murmurs that sounded more like waves than words. Aeneas lay down as well, his cloak drawn over his shoulders. The earth beneath him was firm, and through it he could almost feel the faint tremor of rivers deep below, moving toward an unseen sea. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness saw cities rising, walls white as bone, temples bright with marble, markets humming with voices not yet born. He saw centuries spinning outward like sparks from a single flame. And he saw peace, brief and imperfect, but real. Fought for, built, lost, rebuilt again. Somewhere in that vision a child laughed, and he understood that the gods had traded one heartbeat for another. Turnus's silence for the rhythm of a world that would not stop beating. Night deepened. The fires dimmed to red coals. The river whispered secrets to the reeds, old ones, patient ones, already speaking in the language of Rome. The gods listened, but said nothing. They had made their move, the rest belonged to mortals. And on that field where grief and hope lay side by side, the wind turned softly toward the sea, carrying with it the first quiet breath of a nation not yet named. And that is how the plains of Latium fell silent again. The storm spent, the prophecy kept, and a single heartbeat traded for the promise of a nation. Aeneas has walked through fire, sea, and sorrow to reach this stillness. From the ashes of this field, new walls will rise, new names will be spoken, and somewhere in that future the word Rome will find its first breath. If you made it to the end without falling asleep, the gods of attention are smiling on you. But if you did drift off halfway through, well, that's exactly what this channel is for. Tell me where you're listening from, what city, what country, maybe what time of night it is. I love seeing where these stories travel. And if you truly enjoy these journeys through ancient history, leave a like, subscribe, and join us again next week. Because next time, as the dust settles and the first stones are laid, we begin not a war, but a world.